Go down the line, your last name. Start with John Lilly.
Mr. Jones.
Mr. Hudson.
Mr. Spencer.
Mr. Charity, Mr. Wiley,
Mr. Sullivan.
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Brown.
Mr. Solomon.
Mr. Rice.
Mr. Robinson.
Mr. Harris. Mr. Holmes.
I'm Mr. Farrell. That's Mr. Porter on the camera there. All of these gentlemen are here for you. So I want you to stand up and tell me your last name, Mr. Stand up. Mr. what?
Spencer.
Mr. Spencer, thank you. Speak up, Ellen. Stand up. Mr. who? I can't hear you. Speak up. Mr. McGee, good to meet you.
Mr. Spencer.
Mr. Spencer.
Mr. Ortiz.
Mr. Ortiz.
Mr. Puente.
Fuentes.
Mr. Puller.
I can't hear you.
Puller.
I can't hear you.
Puller.
Mr. Puller. Is it Puller?
Puller.
Stand up. Spell it, please.
P-U-L-L-U-M.
Mr. Puller.
Use outside voice, guys. Outside
All right.
voice.
Mr. Nicholson.
Mr. Nicholson.
Mr. Rice.
Mr. Rice.
Mr. Weaver.
Mr. Weaver.
Mr. Jones.
Mr. Jones.
Mr. Robinson.
Mr. Robinson.
Mr. Watson.
Mr. Watson.
Mr. Davis.
Mr. Davis.
Mr. Curry.
Mr. Curry.
Mr. Turner.
Mr. Turner.
Mr. Nimmers.
Mr. Nimmers.
Mr. Turner.
Mr. Turner. Take your hood off, man. Now stand up and yell at me.
Terrence.
Like I was getting ready to get in a car accident, you didn't want me to get hit.
Terrence.
Mr. Terrence, thank you. I can't hear you.
Mr. LaFleur. Mr. LaFleur.
Outside voice.
Mr. LaFleur.
Mr. LaFleur.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Harris.
Mr. Harris.
Mr. Jones.
Mr. Jones.
Mr. Harris.
Mr. Harris.